casually used the descriptor Jacobite many times during our historical forays among the Munros, but we've never actually taken the time to explain its meaning to those unfamiliar with Scottish history. As we enter Glencoe, the scene of an ostensibly anti-Jacobite military operation of considerable historical significance, it's time to find out just what Jacobitism was, and grab the popcorn to uncover the almost unbelievable political contrivances that led to its emergence. This era saw a polarised and highly charged political atmosphere, not entirely dissimilar to the so-called culture wars and toxic disagreements around British sovereignty that we see today. The main difference being, this culture war wasn't fought by keyboard on the battlegrounds of Twitter or Reddit, but with deadly force on the streets and fields of Britain. Instead of caps lock rage or sarcastic emoji usage, here debates were settled with guns, knives or blunt objects, and with considerably less nuance than even the average YouTube comment section. This is the period in which Thomas Hobbes famously described the life of man as, quote, nasty, brutish and short, the age of civil war. Instead of Brexit or so-called cancel culture, the political hot potato here was the political union of England, Scotland and Ireland, and precisely what form this government should take. It's hardly a spoiler to say that these questions have yet to be resolved to this day, but here they were further complicated by bitter religious sectarianism that obfuscated the key issues and prevented any meaningful progress in public debate. The Jacobite cause is often referred to as a rebellion, but like all history, it didn't occur in a vacuum. In fact, the Jacobites were counter-revolutionaries. They sought to reverse the seismic political changes that they saw as having been forced upon Britain, that is, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which William of Orange had, quote, swept to power on a Protestant wind, or in English, by means of a conservative coup engineered by the English establishment. Of course, any historical event referred to in terms such as glorious should immediately arouse suspicion, and indeed for the general populace there was precious little glory in this so-called revolution. For Scotland and Ireland, it represented a new level of bloody oppression and the imposition of an even more alien authority than that of Westminster, one that had, at best, an extremely tenuous basis in law. Simply put, the Jacobites sought to reverse these changes by restoring the previous order and their king, James II and VII, or in Latin, Jacobus, thus Jacobites. While Ireland and Scotland may have seen the Jacobite Risings, there were indeed Jacobites all over this soon-to-be United Kingdom. But how did Britain find itself in this mess? How bad must things have been for the establishment to invite a European ruler to invade the country? Well, it turns out pretty bad. England was on the brink of another civil war, Ireland was in open revolt, and in Scotland, the age of the forays meant the Central Highlands was in chaos, while the Lowlands had descended into bitter sectarianism. There are many long and complex reasons why the Glorious Revolution occurred, but essentially it boils down to A. the Protestant establishment's fear of Catholic France, and B. the disastrous mistakes of the final Stuart kings. Stuart comes from steward, a position that the dynasty occupied in its early years. The Stuart kings had ruled Scotland from the 14th century, and by the dawn of the 17th, the family were powerful and influential within the British and European aristocracies. This continental influence saw the spelling of the family name change to the French-styled Stuart. Unfortunately, in order to understand events herein, we need to talk about religion. In the mid-16th century, a paradigm shift known as the Protestant Reformation occurred in Europe, in which the Christian Church divided into Catholic tradition and the newly established Protestant faith. To cut a long story short, the Reformation occurred because of A, the invention of the printing press, and B, men like Martin Luther challenging the Catholic tradition of indulgence. That is, the idea that financial gifts would not only bring you closer to God, but could actually get you into heaven. Protestant belief held instead that piety, austerity, and above all, hard work brought you into God's favour. No golden thrones or private art collections for these guys. Life was suffering, and if you didn't suffer enough in life, well, you went to hell. Now, I'm no theologist, but I think there's a happier medium in there somewhere. As we'll see, whether one was Protestant or Catholic wasn't just about religion, but politics. Specifically, the roles of the church, state, and monarch in Christian society. In Scotland, these questions created divisions even among the Highland clans, which provided the establishment with yet more opportunities for coercion and manipulation. The illustrious Scottish royal family, the Stuarts, soon to be kings of Britain, attempted to navigate the treacherous waters of 17th century political opinion with decidedly mixed results. The question of sovereignty would embroil the British Isles in a century of seemingly endless wars, sectarian paranoia, and political contrivance that ultimately left the constituent nations clumsily welded together under parliamentary rule and a monarchy. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England and Ireland, wrote two sizable treatises on the role and status of the king, modestly claiming that the monarch was bestowed with holy authority and thus answerable only to God himself. James declared it only natural that legislature, that is the law, parliament and the greater population were subordinate to the crown because they were mere mortals, whereas the king, yeah, you get the idea. This principle he termed the divine right of kings, and let's just say that it was not without its critics. James VI oversaw the binding of Scotland, England and Ireland together under a single throne via the Union of the Crowns in 1603, a so-called regal union whereby each nation kept its own parliament, for all that that was worth. James really wanted the title of King of Great Britain, but was told by his advisors that there was no legal basis for this, as such a country did not exist. Yet. If you've ever wondered why Ireland has such a bloody recent history, well, a good place to start is with James I and his establishment of the Irish plantations. James had the bright idea of annexing Ulster in the northeast of Ireland as essentially a giant English Protestant allotment, forcing many Catholic Gaels from their lands and giving these to English and Scottish Protestant landowners, who came to be known as settlers. This was similar to the anti-Gallic assault being waged in Scotland, but here in Ireland it was infused with an additional helping of rabid anti-Catholic sentiment. The term plantation carries grim colonialist connotations today, and here the Ulster plantations were the result of the same misguided concepts of British racial and religious supremacy. Instead of having to ship in slaves to work the fields, however, the remaining local inhabitants were forced into indentured servitude, and in case you haven't worked out by now where this is going, these locals were poor Catholic families with little choice but to comply. To say that this was inflammatory and a direct incitement to Irish Catholics to rebel would still be an understatement. James had thrown fuel onto a fire that would cause centuries of violence, hatred and suffering, not least to his own family. When said rebellions duly occurred in Ireland, the brutal and long-remembered English campaigns of Oliver Cromwell decimated Gaelic Catholics and imbued the Irish population with a deep-rooted hatred of English authority. It was in this cauldron of resentment that the Irish Jacobite cause would brew. When Cromwell led his parliamentarian army back to London in 1648, however, his quarrel was with the King of England himself. The incumbent King of England here was Charles I, James's son, who was, to put it mildly, not great at the whole monarchy thing. Indoctrinated by his father's divine right of kings shtick, his ineptitude was catastrophic. His paranoid insecurity drove him to call in Catholic, French and Irish troops against his own people in a battle over the primacy of king or legislature. A battle he would not win. Charles was imprisoned by the new model army, then tried and executed for treason in a very public manner. The first known regicide of a sitting English monarch caused far more problems in the long run than it attempted to solve. Charles' son, also called Charles, was then made King of Scotland in February 1649, but after his forces were defeated at the Battle of Worcester, it quickly became apparent that this was wishful thinking. He was soon forced to join his brother in exile in France. The whole point of Cromwell's crusade across Britain was to reforge England, and by extension Scotland and Ireland, as a republic with no king and rule by the people themselves. Sounds great, right? Well, not so much unless you like really strict puritanical regimes, where supposedly sinful indulgences such as sex, alcohol or even tobacco were so repressed as to make the Victorian era seem hedonistic in comparison. After the aforementioned period of costly experimentation with an English republic based on joyless religious extremism, it was decided that perhaps the whole monarchy thing wasn't such a bad idea after all. The aforementioned Thomas Hobbes didn't just moan about things, he was one of the first Western political theorists. He brought a lighthouse of reason to the maelstrom of prejudice and violence in his landmark work, Leviathan. Hobbes put forward the theory that civilized society is based upon a transactional exchange between those with power and those without, a concept Hobbes called the social contract. This was massively influential because it not only made sense of why the anarchy was happening, but it did so in a very accessible and persuasive way. Hobbes noted the disparity between civil society and man's, quote, state of nature, that is, how people treat each other when there is no functional government to enforce the law. This he termed war of all against all, which was pretty much what Britain was experiencing at the time. It wasn't that Hobbes took a dim view of human nature, well, maybe a bit, but the broader idea that people tended to be individualistic, whereas civilized society required them to be collectivist. Thus, there needed to be some kind of incentive for people to act as citizens rather than lone wolves or tribes. A society could only be civil if the majority bought into the social contract, the idea that those without power submit to the laws of the state in return for the state's protection and the benefits of said civilized society. For example, not having to live with the threat of murder at every turn. As you've probably sussed by now, James I and Charles I would not have been the biggest fans of Hobbes' ideas. To the Stuart monarchs, there were no natural rights of man, only the God-given divine right of kings, which made the idea of a social contract utterly irrelevant. For those who read Leviathan, the realisation began to dawn that leaving things to play out according to God's plan wasn't actually a great political strategy, and that actually humans could construct their own theories of power and government that didn't require supernatural causation in order to be just or fair. The Republican government of this British Commonwealth wouldn't survive long beyond Cromwell's death in 1658. Within a couple of years, it had collapsed, leaving a golden opportunity for the Cavalier's dream, the return of the king. Said king was to be Charles' heir, Charles Edward Stuart, who had been sunning himself, enduring painful exile in France while the anarchy of the English interregnum took place. It was therefore indeed a cause de célèbre when Charles Edward Stuart was invited to take the throne as Charles II. This would come to be known to historians as the Restoration. It led to an outpouring of art and literature as the three kingdoms basked in their newfound freedom of expression under a popular king who, let's just say, wasn't averse to having a good time himself. On the face of it, Charles II had many options. The wave of popularity on which he swept in meant that he had a mandate to enact whatever laws he saw fit, but in reality the chasm of sectarianism stood in the way of any sort of meaningful discussion on political sovereignty or progression beyond a system of government that was clearly no longer fit for purpose. In extremely broad terms, Catholicism represented a belief in a divinely ordained authoritarian regime, while Protestantism represented what we would now term a more democratic system that dared to credit the layfolk with agency and intelligence of their own. Needless to say, the majority of the general population in Britain had long chosen the latter, but it was not certain that Protestantism would endure in the face of its mighty Catholic nemesis, Rome and the military superpower of France. Public opinion trended towards fear of a return to Catholic rule, and this quickly developed into open prejudice and rampant paranoia. Anti-Catholic hatred consumed British society at all levels, tearing families apart and accelerating the social cleansing of Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. As such, Charles' only real option was to attempt to maintain his power by reading the political winds. He enacted the Declaration of Indulgence, which sounds more fun than it actually entailed, by which the population could choose their faith without persecution or fear of the authorities. Unfortunately, in the cold light of public opinion, this wasn't worth the parchment on which it was inscribed. Catholicism was the other, the alien menace at which many scapegoat hunters could easily take aim. The widespread political undercurrent was not unlike modern-day Islamophobia in its insidious and pervasive nature. Upon Charles' death in 1685, he was succeeded by his brother, James II of England and 7th of Scotland. There was a big problem, however. James had converted to Catholicism. This created the exclusion crisis, where in the latter years of Charles II's reign, the establishment tried desperately to prevent James' succession. A compromise was reached, but the argument that it created birthed the first modern political parties in the Whigs, who vehemently opposed James, and the Tories, who didn't like him either, but at least acknowledged his legal claim to the throne. James had wangled his way in, but no one was particularly happy about it. It was during his short reign that public opinion of the Stuarts would reach its catastrophic nadir and force them from power forever. There are many reasons a hereditary monarchy doesn't work as a long-term system of government, among the most pertinent being that if a king is really bad at politics, the country is in big trouble. The reign of James II and VII was defined by his utter ineptitude and tone-deaf approach to his subjects, but, as his great-grandfather had declared, the king possessed divine infallibility. There could be no vote of no confidence. If there had, the result would have been almost unanimous in calling for his replacement. As mentioned, James had converted to Catholicism, yet ruled a Protestant kingdom, which you don't need to be a historian to realise was probably not going to work. Indeed, the establishment only accepted his coronation because his Protestant daughter Mary was next in line for the throne. Put up with this guy and we'll get a Protestant next time. However, James had other ideas. Well-meaning but hopelessly out of his depth, James had inherited both his father's arcane views on government and his blinkered, bull-headed intransigence on the subject. James was tactless, indecisive, and had little grasp of legal argument. His lack of righteous Protestant zeal, his wishy-washy equivocating, and hopelessly naive rhetoric about Catholics being afforded equal status in society alienated the vast majority of his public. A minority of nonconformists supported him, most likely because they thought his inability to compromise was deliberate. James openly favoured Catholics in his government and saw no reason to explain himself. To him, that old divine right of kings meant only God could sway him. So great was his belief in this divine right that he rejected prudent compromise even when the Pope's council strongly advised it. Now, this wasn't informed fortitude or resilience. James simply didn't appear to understand or recognise the importance of public perception in politics, naively blundering his way into deeper crises and unpopularity. In 1685, James issued a declaration of indulgence in Scotland, which basically allowed the practice of Catholicism. In England, he attempted an even more ambitious, some would say foolhardy, attempt to unite almost the entire religious spectrum with his Declaration of the Liberty of Conscience, believing that such freedom of choice would lead to mass conversion to Catholicism. It didn't, and 7 prominent Protestant bishops were put on trial for refusing the declaration, further enraging the populace. It's important to note that it wasn't just Protestants who found James repulsive. Many Catholics were just as enraged by James' lack of intolerance towards Protestantism. This state of affairs was bad enough, but it was about to become completely untenable with the birth of James' son, James Francis Edward Stuart, who replaced Mary as heir to the throne and had been baptised a Catholic. To the public and establishment alike, the young heir seemingly represented confirmation of their worst fears. His father James was trying to make Britain Catholic again and subjugate England to its nemesis, France. Things had gone far enough. The question was how to remove a sitting monarch without igniting another civil war. Simply chopping off James's head, as evidenced earlier in the century, would all but guarantee such an outcome. It seemed that this required a political solution, one that would not involve violence and bloodshed, or at least would not primarily rely on such means to work. James' British army, properly marshalled, remained a match for any foreign invader, and besides, simply waiting for a rival to invade would be completely suicidal, given that said rival would almost certainly be France. The other great power in Europe at this time was the Dutch-led union of Protestant and Catholic nations opposed to France and its despotic monarch, Louis XIV. It was to the leader of this alliance, the Dutch stadtholder and Prince of Orange, that the English establishment turned to sort out their problems. This man's name was Willem Hendrik, but he would come to be known to history as William of Orange. To give you a glimpse into the soap opera-like nature of the European aristocracy, William of Orange was not only part Stuart, but James II and VII's son-in-law, having married the king's aforementioned Protestant daughter Mary. Oh no, you didn't. It was on this very detail, in fact, that the entire scheme was predicated. A Queen Mary provided the legitimacy of a Stuart monarch to offset the rather troublesome optics of a Dutchman sharing the throne. To his credit, William was an accomplished war leader with a deeply strategic mind and high political intelligence, much admired as an exemplar of military success. He was also, crucially, a Protestant. A group of noblemen who, despite the fact that they're now deceased, came to be known as the Immortal Seven, conceived of a proposal whereby William would be invited to, quote, invade, unquote, and the British army would essentially pretend not to notice, offering minimal if any resistance. This slightly ridiculous scenario would protect the Immortal Seven, and the rest of those responsible for the invitation, from accusations of treason. Put simply, international relations of the time generally dictated that if there was a battle involved, a regime change was legitimate. Without consultation with Ireland and Scotland, for reasons that by now should be apparent, the invitation to William was sent. The die had been cast. William, like most European leaders of the time, was primarily concerned with establishing a viable defence against the totalitarian might of Catholic France. A political and religious conservative, his wars were driven not by a desire for conquest and glory, but with the aims of security and consolidation. Keeping France at bay would require enormous armies, and these would need to be replenished as necessary. The prospect of having British troops to call upon in his campaigns was extremely persuasive, as indeed was having the formidable power of the Royal Navy at his command. William accepted the invitation, and, clearly aware of the importance of putting on a good show, assembled an enormous invasion fleet, the largest ever seen, to invade England, landing at Torbay in Devon. His landing was postponed due to the fleet becoming becalmed at sea, but eventually the so-called Protestant wind brought them to the English coast on November the 11th, 1688. William faced essentially no resistance, forming a, quote, popular uprising. It seemed that despite James' orders, the King's army had been dispersed widely around the country so as to offer little threat. Apparently many officers in said army also had no problem with letting a foreign usurper take the throne if it rid them of their despised Catholic monarch. Now, James wasn't a complete fool. He had contingency plans in case of military attack and promptly left London with the intent of leading his forces to meet the invading army to the northeast. This was not to be. Some of James' key officers, including some of his own kin, abandoned him and defected to William. In addition to this humiliating setback, James was in increasingly poor health. He decided to retreat back to London on November the 23rd, 1688. He soon announced that he was willing to agree to a free parliament, an uncharacteristic, and some might say utterly spineless, capitulation that he hoped would undo all his pro-Catholic policy in order to save his own neck. Even James could read the writing on this wall, however, and in secret he made plans to leave the country. Scotland was too far, too dangerous, and perhaps too obvious, and he reasoned that only his cousin Louis XIV's France now offered safe harbour, not to mention a nice chateau, for a deposed Catholic monarch. Before he could attempt to escape, however, he was captured and placed under house arrest. Compared to his father, he had a pretty easy time of it. Indeed, he was essentially allowed to escape captivity not once but twice, in a manner that strongly suggests William wanted him to leave the country of his own free will. It's also likely that, given what happened last time, there was little to no public appetite for his persecution or captivity. This was the opposite of his father's situation. There would be no public trial or execution, because the government simply didn't want public attention to focus on the details of what had just transpired. In December 1688, James made his first attempt to escape, but was captured by a group of overzealous fishermen and returned to London, presumably much to the annoyance of the new regime. Later that month, he was afforded another attempt, and this time successfully fled to France, where he would now hold court in exile. William reached London without encountering any serious resistance, and was crowned King William III, reigning, despite his best efforts to rule alone, alongside his wife, Mary II. This new, double-bottomed Protestant monarchy was a cause of great celebration, with many elites expressing hyperbolic relief at finally having put an end to the centuries of religious and political turmoil. Now, if you're wondering why there wasn't more widespread resistance among the population to this ugly do-over, the attitude among the general public to the fairly obvious change of regime was basically better the Protestant Dutch than the Catholic French, and to be fair, the economic future for Britain was now fairly bright. The faceless wielders of the political dark arts had beaten the trap. Britain had been invaded for a second time, and this conquest would be permanent. From now on, a foreign dynasty would hold the British thrones, leaving the Scottish royal family in exile. All of this had been achieved, in relative historical terms at least, with the general public barely batting an eyelid. In the rest of Britain, the new order was less warmly received, of course, but in general was again seen by the vast majority as preferable to Calamity James and his Catholic offspring. The Covenanters, puritanical extremists intent on removing any Catholic influence on Scottish society, and the centrist Whigs, the main British political party at the time, allied themselves with William because their aims broadly aligned with his. That is, ostensibly, the reinforcement of Protestant values across the British nations. The Whigs' main allies in the Scottish Highlands were the Campbells, with many of the clan now occupying key positions in the British government as a result of their speedy acquiescence to the new king. To historians, these enablers of the Glorious Revolution are termed Williamites, as opposed to those who wanted King Billy gone and James restored, the Jacobites. Ranged against William were some Tories, again this term has a rather different meaning now than it did at this time, and the Episcopalian, often Gaelic-speaking populations of Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. Yep, that's right, by now the sectarianism had become even more complicated by subdividing into Presbyterian and Episcopalian worship. These were basically diet versions of Protestantism and Catholicism respectively that diverged on whether the church should be quasi-democratic or ruled top-down by bishops. Presbyterianism manifested in movements like the Puritans and the Covenanters, while Episcopalianism enjoyed the backing of the powerful Catholic Church. This was a very serious topic at the time, and everyone, from the establishment to the working class, had an opinion on it. Famously, when an Episcopalian minister had attempted to give a sermon in Edinburgh that seemed to lean too far toward Catholic ideas, he was greeted by a spirited parishioner throwing her prayer book at him and shouting, "Dost thou say mass at my lug?" Yeah, remember that there was no internet back then, and people had nothing better to do than argue in public about obtuse trivia that had little to no bearing on their lives. Oh, hang on. Well, at least they did so in person. The dust may have settled in London under William's new Protestant regime, but far from the corridors of power, a formidable Highland host was preparing for war. In March 1689, James II and VII landed on the south coast of Ireland with 2,500 French troops to take command of the 35,000 strong Irish Jacobite army, forcing the siege of Derry and eventually taking Dublin, with the intent to fight his way up to the north coast and from there invade Scotland. However, the Convention of the Estates, a temporary Scottish government of establishment figures ruling in James' stead, and crucially of William's own engineering, duly gave its approval to William and Mary, declaring that James had abdicated the throne, leaving Britain in peril, which is certainly a unique take on events. Importantly though, this wasn't a unanimous decision. One particular member of the convention stormed out in disgust at the result, taking 50 dragoons and riding north to Dundee. While it's certainly true that by 1688, events in London were still seen by most Highlanders as having little to no bearing on their affairs, many clans or their individual members perceived William as godless, illegitimate and dangerous. Nevertheless, no military leader emerged behind which these so-called Jacobite rebels could rally, and we know that these guys had plenty of internecine conflicts to overcome if they were to form any kind of meaningful resistance. In a few months, however, this would change with the arrival in the Highlands of John Graham, Lord of Claverhouse, known formally among other wordy titles as 1st Viscount Dundee. An experienced military strategist, fluent in the logistics of warfare, Dundee was the greatest military leader that the Jacobite cause would ever have. A decorated and respected figure, he had previously fought for the Dutch and the French, during which time he had supposedly saved the life of none other than William of Orange himself on the battlefield, which is a cool story, but it's also highly unlikely that this ever happened. Before hunting down Covenanters in Scotland for James II and VII, earning the nickname among Whigs as Bloody Clavers. A staunch supporter of the Stuarts and everything they stood for, he earned his titles from James for his outstanding service, but just 2 weeks later, James had fled, and Dundee knew that he wasn't exactly going to be welcome under the new regime. He relocated to Dundee and, on a visit to Edinburgh, was seen conversing with a known Jacobite in a coffee house, fueling much gossip among the political class. Coffee houses were at this time considered hotbeds of rebellion by the establishment, mainly because intelligent people met in them to have meaningful conversations about politics. This was enough for the Convention of Estates, fearing a coup, to declare Dundee a fugitive and rebel, despite his considerable service to the Scots throne. Dundee was certainly not the only public servant to find himself cast aside by the new regime, but he was one of the most influential. The Scottish establishment feared his arrival because Graham was a man who many disgruntled Highlanders would listen to and take inspiration from, and given how said establishment had treated him, he really wasn't going to be in the mood to parley. Atop Dundee law, Graham and around 50 prominent Jacobites unfurled the Stuart standard and declared themselves in solidarity with the Jacobite cause, the first public demonstration of resistance to William. So began the 89, the first Jacobite Rising. The Scottish Jacobites' intent was to prepare Scotland for James's invasion from Ireland by weakening the government forces. Graham then covered a great deal of ground in the Highlands to assemble a fighting force from many different Highland clans. Allied with Graham were the MacDonalds under MacIan of Glencoe, Col O'Donnell of Keppoch, as well as MacLeans, Camerons, Clan Ranalds, Glengarry MacDonalds, and also, thanks to James, a contingent of Irish troops on the way. While it's certainly true that many of these clansmen may well have been more interested in retribution against the Campbells and their government cronies than the politics of regime change, it ultimately mattered little. They were all highly motivated and, under the right leader, posed a significant threat to the new order. While Graham's Highland recruitment drive had amassed only 1,700 men in total, the government did not know this. In response, they sent troops to quell this rebellion, and after some cat-and-mouse manoeuvres, the two sides met at the much-storied Battle of Killiecrankie on the 27th of July 1689. The government troops were mostly lowlanders commanded by General Hugh Mackay, and while they had greater numbers, the Jacobites held home advantage, and the element of surprise. Rumours among the Whigs claimed that Graham had gone into hiding, dispirited, having failed to gain any support for his cause. Anyone who believed this was about to be given a violent reality check. At Killiecrankie, Graham's military prowess proved instrumental. Highland warfare had traditionally incorporated guile and guerrilla tactics, and Graham's men lay in wait in the hills above the narrow pass of Killiecrankie for Mackay's men to file through it and enter their trap. Said pass was far too small for an army to retreat in a hurry, and Graham aimed to set up a kill zone in which the Highland charge would be inescapable. The Macleans, the Irish regiment, and the Clanranald and Glengarry MacDonalds comprised the left flank of the Jacobite line, with the Camerons and Glencoe, Sleat and Keppoch MacDonalds on the right, with Graham and his dragoons leading from the centre. As Mackay passed below the hill, however, he noticed the Jacobites lying in wait on the higher ground. He quickly marshalled his men into a long continuous line, only 3 men deep. This was to take advantage of his superior firepower, the idea being to decimate the Highlanders' charge before they got close enough to use their claymores. Graham's men faced off against the government army below them for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, with neither side apparently willing to initiate all-out combat. The reason for this was that Graham was waiting for the sun to lower behind the hills so that it was no longer shining into the eyes of his troops. Around 8 PM, with the last rays disappearing below the horizon, the Jacobite army charged. While Sassenachs had encountered the Highland charge before, its deployment at Killiecrankie demonstrated its psychological power to devastating effect. Mackay knew the futility of meeting a downhill charge like this head-on and ordered his men to fire their muskets at the oncoming Highlanders. Guns at this time were still highly unreliable weapons of war, and misfire or straight-up explosion were on average as likely as a successful firing. With their barrage seemingly having little effect on the Highland charge, the government troops were forced to quickly fix bayonets for close quarters combat. Unfortunately for them, their muskets required them to screw the bayonet onto the end before use, a design feature so idiotic it's almost without parallel in history, but not quite. The right flank of the Jacobite charge was devastating, with the MacDonalds eviscerating the shallow government line with relative ease. The charge quickly overran the government's defensive line, and though Mackay's men managed to take out almost a third of the Jacobite forces, it soon became apparent that they had lost the battle. Mackay himself had met this charge and fought onwards through it, only to find himself alone on the hillside to turn back round for a grandstand view of his army in disarray as the Jacobites overran them. A rout ensued in which Mackay's army was forced to beat a humiliating retreat as best they could over the hills or through the pass. The first battle for the Jacobite cause had been won. If the goal was for the Jacobites to be taken seriously, Dundee and his men had stuck it in the top corner and burst the net. However, this resounding victory had come at a great cost. During the valiant charge, John Graham, Dundee himself, had been mortally wounded. Dundee's death, while deeply lamented, was a far greater blow than anyone would realise at the time. Never again would the Jacobite cause have a leader capable of defeating greater numbers and superior firepower in such a decisive way. In the cold light of history, Killiecrankie would prove to be a fairly pointless battle, and the loss of their leader completely unnecessary. Graham was worth exponentially more to the Jacobites as a living, functioning general than as a dead martyr. Had Dundee survived, the ensuing history would have been very different, and it's hard to imagine how the circumstances that resulted in the Glencoe massacre would have been allowed to occur. the Jacobites held another council of war at Blair Castle to take stock. A man named Cannon took over, but given he didn't speak Gaelic, was generally a bit of a damp squib in comparison. He led a pointless and costly raid on Dunkeld, and after a decimating ambush at the Howe of Cromdale, the Jacobites eventually dispersed to the Glens after another meeting at Blair Castle, with Cannon disappearing to France. In Scotland, round one of the Jacobite Risings was now over, both sides blooded but still in the fight. The Jacobites in Ireland were the next problem for William, led by their king and aided by the dreaded French. In the Southern Highlands, the age of the forays had seen the emergence of Highland raiding parties, among the most brazen and notorious being the MacDonalds of Glencoe and MacDonalds of Keppoch. These came to be known to their victims as the gallows herd, because the dreaded gallows at Inverary supposedly awaited them if they could be caught. Earlier in the century, a previous Macian of Glencoe and his men had feuded with the Stuarts of Appin, murdering many clansmen and relieving them of most of their cattle. Accordingly, letters of fire and sword were issued against them, and Macian and his brother had been beheaded by the Stuarts in retaliation. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. In 1689, the Macian chief was Alistair MacDonald, who was by now an old man, but still saw the Campbell lands and cattle as fair targets. Following the Jacobite meeting at Blair Castle, the MacDonalds of Glencoe and MacDonalds of Keppoch made their way back slowly via Breadalbin, Glenlyon and Rannoch Moor, murdering, stealing or destroying pretty much everything that they could get their hands on, acts which they supposedly justified as a repayment for their soldiering. It just so happened that these lands were those of Robert Campbell of Glenlyon, a destitute alcoholic and gambler whose last possessions, including a magnificent red stallion, had just been fleeced by the accursed MacDonalds, his mortal enemies, and taken back to Glencoe. This final insult would not be forgotten. James' Irish campaign saw him establish control of the majority of the country, calling a new parliament and providing a brief period of happiness and security for the Irish Catholic population. However, his plan to continue north to Scotland had hit a big snag: Ulster. Remember those Protestant settlers introduced to the area by James I? Well, their descendants put up such fierce resistance that his grandson couldn't capture it despite his best efforts. Instead of continuing on the offensive into Scotland, James was now forced into a defensive war to hold Ireland. William, meanwhile, needed the Jacobites in Ireland dealt with as soon as possible so that he could fight the French without distraction or ambush from the back door. He landed in Carrickfergus on the 14th of July 1690 with around 35,000 Danes, Swiss, Dutch and English troops, fighting his way south to meet James' forces at the now infamous Battle of the Boyne. Here, James' lack of military expertise was sorely exposed by William's experience and tactical nous, and the battle ended with victory for the Orangemen. Defeat at the Boyne meant the Irish Jacobites' only option was now to retreat to Limerick on the west coast, where they were besieged by William's forces and finally worn down. This forced the rebels to sign the Treaty of Limerick, which essentially ended the Irish Jacobite threat. James again returned to France to lick his wounds, and would never again set foot on the British Isles. For the victorious Prince of Orange, meanwhile, the only domestic loose ends remaining were the desperate Jacobites in the Scottish Highlands. These, William reasoned, were a far lesser threat than the Irish rebels, and thus a problem that he could delegate to his government, allowing him to return his full attention to the main fight against France. This gave said government considerable power and a dangerously nebulous directive. Basically, take care of those Scottish Jacobites for me, which they could interpret as they saw fit. William would sign orders, but he would never visit Scotland himself, likely due to his severe asthma. He also considered the nation to be of little relevance to him. He instead relied on what his Scottish advisors told him was happening there to inform his decisions, and these advisors certainly weren't averse to taking artistic license with their reporting if it served their own political agendas. Those paying attention will remember that Campbells now occupied high government positions, and as we'll see next time, there were undoubtedly some of these who saw in this edict from William an unprecedented opportunity for revenge against the gallows herd in their kin. In Scotland and Ireland, the apparent deification of the Stuart dynasty, with James as noble martyr, was somewhat ironic given that the Stuarts had long schemed and bristled against the power of the Gaeltacht, while kings of Scotland. James himself had little interest in Highland affairs, and outside of their potential military usage, viewed the Highlanders and the Gaeltacht with at best indifference. In reality, those who considered themselves Jacobites were not necessarily in the James VII fan club. Indeed, many of his supporters aligned themselves with him out of sheer desperation. James represented the old order, the moral supremacy of God and king over the sinful layfolk. It may sound counterintuitive, but what the Jacobites wanted wasn't necessarily James on the throne, but more generally a second Stuart restoration in which the values they represented under Charles II would be restored. This would never happen, and with the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to understand why. This time, the king had been replaced without violence by someone who actually had a clue what they were doing, and crucially in circumstances that made it inevitable for limits to be placed on the power of the monarch. In the creation of the historic Bill of Rights, William was coerced into accepting far less control than he had envisioned in the first place, and forced to concede more power to Parliament, and thus the people, than he would otherwise have liked. Many in Britain saw this as progress, and by most measures of functional and sustainable society, they were right. The stark truth was, the Stuarts were political dinosaurs, and the impact and aftermath of William I's coronation was the meteorite that wiped them out, changing the political landscape and the course of British history forever. The Jacobite cause had a different definition of progress that had little to do with the primacy of democracy, and indeed could even be accused of being pro-authoritarian in some aspects. The old alliance between Scotland and France now represented Scotland's potential subjugation to a ostensibly fascist superpower. Louis XIV was not someone who could be coerced into ceding even an inch of his supposedly divine mandate. There was also the economic factor that we touched on earlier. Had the Jacobites ultimately succeeded in their aims, Britain, and particularly Scotland, would have been shut out of the nascent Dutch stock exchange, the manipulation of which would later play a big part in the financing of the British Empire. Now, while such a defanging of Britain's colonialist ambitions would have been of great public service to those outside it, the effect on Britain's economies would have been significant, making the nations even more dependent upon France. This is where equating Jacobitism and, for example, modern Scottish nationalism falls down. There was no intention or likelihood of Scotland, quote, going it alone. Before they could dissolve the hated union with England, they would have to take Great Britain itself. We'll continue the Jacobite story in later episodes, but you've probably heard much about the final act of the saga. Bonnie Prince Charlie, the march to Derby, and finally disaster at Culloden. After the massacre of Glencoe, Jacobitism began to be co-opted to the extent that by 1745 it had become less about restoring the Stuarts themselves and more a convenient bandwagon for a broad spectrum of disgruntled actors opposed to English rule or the very United Kingdom itself. Jacobitism was later the subject of much art, prose, music and poetry, with all the romanticism and artistic interpretation such media entail. This is why it's so poorly understood and mythologised in the modern era. For example, depicting the Stuarts as infantile cherub-like angels who wouldn't hurt a fly may be amusing to those with a passing knowledge of history, but it's also hugely disingenuous, airbrushing out their frankly less than angelic actions. The annexation of Ulster, declaring war on their own people, and industrialising the slave trade, to name but a few. Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott indeed have a great deal to answer for regarding this hagiographic, revisionist narrative of clear good guys, bad guys, and, best of all, Bonnie Dundee. I mean, take these two paintings of John Bonnie Dundee Graham, for example. One of these is accurate, and I don't think you need me to tell you which one it is. Whether the Jacobite cause is something to celebrate today is up to the viewer to decide, but in terms of relevance, it does kind of lie on the wrong side of history. Those less charitable than myself might point out that, in their fanatical devotion to restoring an imagined halcyon era at the cost of their own economic prosperity, Jacobites arguably had more in common with Brexiteers than Scottish nationalists, but I'll be kind and say that this too is a tenuous analogy. And that brings us to 1691. So far in Series 2, we've learned about the Campbells, the MacDonalds, and the Jacobite cause. We're now ready to tackle the complex story of the Glencoe massacre itself in the next episodes. You may think that you know the tale, but the reality was far messier and less clear-cut than it's usually presented in popular retellings, and buckle up, because the real culprits may not be who you think. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, hit like and subscribe to see new episodes as soon as they arrive. And to support the show, hit us up on Patreon, where for just £3 a month you can get exclusive content and behind the scenes updates. Until next time, enjoy your adventures.